In today's remote and hybrid workforce, we're getting more pressure than ever from users who want to access their corporate resources on their personal devices that aren't managed by IT. On top of that, with the default settings in Microsoft, they can actually do that unimpeded from anywhere in the world. So if you're looking to secure access down on these devices but still provide that flexibility, stay tuned because I'm going to be walking you through the step-by-step process for the policies that I would configure to allow for access on these devices, as well as just some of the baselines you would want for secure device access within your organization. Before we dive in, just a quick introduction. My name's Nick. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I've been creating content here in the channel for the better half of a decade. So when we think about an end user accessing their corporate email, sensitive documents, and more on their personal device, it's actually pretty scary given the lack of security protections that might be on this device that would either lead them to being compromised or our data being compromised for weaknesses on that system. So if we think about the typical security stack that we push out today to maintain protections, it's actually quite extensive between AV protections for malware, EDR, firewall, automated patching, as well as some more advanced protections like DNS filtering for secure browsing, application whitelisting, elevation control, and more. So as a general principle, we're always going to try to navigate the conversation, educate our customers around why having managed devices for access is so important. So I always want you to keep that in focus as we do look at protections for providing levels of flexibility. It still leaves you with a lot of inherent risks that we do have to be cognizant of. As we get into the protections, I built this basic diagram with a decision matrix you can see for allowing personal device use. And really, again, we're going to try to navigate the customer over here where we're using managed devices, or if we need to make concessions, we're also looking at leveraging something like AVD or Cloud PC that could be installed on their personal device so we can still containerize our security. Beyond the scope of this video to go into those solutions, but I think it's also something that you should try to pitch if you're knocking them down from, we absolutely need to access this from this device. So if we're going to go into this route, the one thing I'm going to be covering today is the policies for BYOD. I'm not going to be covering, I'll do this in a separate video, the policies I would institute just as a broad sense for your managed devices to basically require them to be in scope and also to have some controls into place so that unauthorized access is prevented for devices outside your network and devices that are joining into Entra, as well as some restrictions for guest users, and then the mobile consideration as well on iOS and Android. If we're going to go into this route though, this is what I'm kind of proposing here. And again, there's a lot of different ways you could do this. So take my recommendations here, but also understand what you can support operationally, both internal to your MSP as well as with the customer. But really at the end of the day, what we're saying here is that we're going to create this BYOD Security Group. And within there, we're going to set the dynamic rules to basically funnel in any personal devices. And from there, I'm going to allow my customer to enroll their personal devices into Intune as an option. And if they do, and if those devices end up being compliant, then I will lighten up the flexibility here, or I should say provide more flexibility for them to access things on their devices versus restricting things down further, which we'll see in these policies. So I'm going to show you guys how to configure all these today, but I'm just going to go through them very quickly so you understand what we're going to be configuring high level here. This restrict browser only, or restrict to browser only on non-compliant devices. This is something that we can do to limit our attack surface. So we're saying web only access to get into, your applications like your mail or your files and folders, things like that within SharePoint and OneDrive. There's a good limit there because we're not getting into the client applications that might be on the device. There also might be active malware. Usually if they're using a typical browser too, like Chrome or something, we may have additional protections that Chrome is just providing in general. But they also might be using just, kind of a crappy browser. So we have to take all that consideration. But the other thing I love that this does is it avoids the users actually registering their devices into Entra. And so if you're familiar with this flow, when a user goes in and they sign into a thick application, if you will, a client application on their desktop, typically we'll ask them to enroll it and it will show up as a registered device within Entra. and even enroll into Intune potentially, depending on how you have your settings. So I want to avoid that clutter, and I don't want their personal devices showing up in our Entra inventory. So that's another area in which we're getting that kind of flow so that we're not having that activity happen and we're not having these devices join or register into our ecosystem. Again, though, we could make the Intune enrollment optional. If they enroll that device, we could allow for more flexibility to say if it's a compliant device within our environment, then you could also access the application. We'll get into the device compliance policy, but basically we're going to say, we have active AV, we have a certain OS level, things like that, that will provide us certain levels of checks to say that there's a minimum level of security on that device. It's not just some random device that we have no idea if it's been patched in months or whatever that might be. Second policy here is for app enforced restrictions. This is something that we can use for kind of our SharePoint ecosystem or Exchange ecosystem for email, and that prevents them from downloading files locally to their device. So this really helps with data exfiltration. Not sure why I put a dash in here. We'll fix that right now. And effectively here, we're saying that they can't download these locally and be copied on some device that might get hit by ransomware, might get have insider threat considerations, those types of things that might go on. Session controls is another one here. So we want to limit their session times. So we're saying basically you have to sign in every hour or less, and we don't allow for persistent browser sessions. So they basically just destroy the token or session token that's on that device or in their browser for the cookie that they have as well too. And that minimizes our chances of any type of token theft for access that an attacker could get if they actively installed malware on that device or anything like that. Requiring a temporary access pass for Intune enrollment. So this is saying we are making Intune enrollment optional. And if you're going to do that, I still want, as the IT provider, to validate that this is an okay device to join into Intune. I'm not getting some Linux device joining into my network when you have that maybe as your personal device. And I want to make sure, it passes some basic security checks at first, but also we're doing this so that we avoid any type of persistence techniques that may be used by attackers, where they typically join a device onto the network after they've compromised the user to maintain persistence in the environment. So this gives us both asset inventory control, where we're saying this is an approved device and we have a process, an SOP for validation. And it also requires this verification, right? So it's not just saying that anybody can register a device onto our network, which is the default setting typically in Microsoft that you have unless you configure additional settings. And then for mobile use for iOS and Android, typically users want to access email and chat on the go, Teams and Outlook specifically. So we will require them, though, to use a MAM policy, which is part of Intune as well. MAM policies are lightweight. They don't require the user to enroll their device into the MDM solution, so there's no remote wipe capabilities of the device itself, but we do get remote wipe capabilities of the data. We prevent jailbroken devices, and we can add additional verification to actually access the app. It's actually managed data for us, like a PIN that we'll see as well too. So these are some really great ones here to allow for that flexibility while still also limiting the user. You could also, for the session controls, say if it's in Intune and it's enrolled, it's compliant, then we don't apply the session control to that. We'll see that more in the policy management. So let's actually start by going through these first two steps here for BYOD and the compliance policy that we want to set up before we actually get into these conditional access policies that we're going to institute. So the first thing that we're going to do here is create a dynamic group that'll capture our devices that are not corporate. So they're just the BYOD devices, or they're unknown in the environment, that show up ideally with the TAP and the other things that we're putting into place. You really wouldn't get an unknown device, but let's go ahead and add this new group within here, and we're going to go ahead and call it something like T-BYOD. You can call it whatever you like there, but the membership type is going to be dynamic device. And then for the query here, we're going to say the device ownership is not equal company. And then they do allow you to validate this rule. So I'm going to add a couple of devices here that'll show you this distinction, one of which is a corporate-owned device, company-owned device, and then the other which is a personal device that gets designated in here. And so we have a validation that my personal device is going to show up, but my corporate device is not. And if you view it, device ownership for this one is company. And then the other one here is personal. So that's exactly what I want. And I'm going to go ahead and click on save for this and click on create. Next, if you pop into the Intune Admin Center, you can go under the devices section. In this example that I'm showing you, I'm really just going to be applying a conditional access policy around Windows devices. And I'm just saying that this environment just has Windows devices. But typically you would want to create this compliance policy with every device type that you support, right? If it's Mac devices, whatever it might look like. But we're going to create a device compliance policy for Windows 10 and later. I'm going to call this T- BYOD default. And then you can go through these settings here. Again, this is up to you what you configure within all these settings. You probably want to require something like BitLocker to be on that device. You want to have potentially a minimum OS version that you maintain over time. And then from a system security perspective, might also require this encryption to be required on the device. Requiring these, I think, is probably the most important for antivirus, TPM, firewall, required Defender anti-malware as an example of that. And then they're not going to have likely the Defender for endpoint version within here. I'm just blazing through this just for the sake of time, but you really would want to apply that for the assignments. And then you can add the groups to here as well, which in our case would be our group that we just created. This is our BYOD group that we're going to apply this to, and then we're going to create that. So those are going to flow through nicely, and then we'll be able to dictate whether or not it's a compliant device or not based off of it flowing through our policy there. Now, if we reshift our focus back to our policies that we're going to create, these are all conditional access policies that we're going to institute here. Except for this one, it's kind of a mix between the MAM policy, and I'll show you additional conditional access policy you can use to require managed applications within the environment, but it's not necessary. And there's going to be some considerations there for end user impact that I'll go through. But let's go ahead and start with this one, just restricted browser only on non-compliant device. So within Entra, we're going to click on new policy here. And then we're going to say block BYOD browser only. You can call it whatever you like there if that doesn't make sense to you for what it's doing, but effectively here, we're going to apply this to all users. You could get granular as far as your group memberships, things like that. I would say that if you're enrolling all personal devices as well into Intune, you could just select your group here for what we created for the BYOD users. But if you're not, we're just saying like they're accessing it on any personal device and they're choosing whether or not to enroll into Intune, then we would want to do all users here. And then under the conditions section here is where we're going to filter out for devices, and you would be filtering out your managed devices. So if we say device ownership, you can have this set for company, if you wanted to say that way, to be able to designate it in that manner. Or if you wanted to do it by trust type, you could equal that to a joined device. So we're basically saying that we want it to be joined into Entra, and that's how we know that it's managed. You can technically do the same for a hybrid environment as well. And we're actually going to say that we're excluding those devices from this policy. And then under the client applications here, we're going to configure this, and we are going to just designate the mobile apps and client desktops. And then for targeted resources, we're going to say all cloud apps. You might want to do, if you're doing this policy, obviously you might want to have a break glass account or break glass exclusion if you're doing all users, just as a call out for best practice. And then under the grant, you're going to block access, right? So we need to make sure, you exclude the user if you're using all users from this. But if you were, again, enrolling users within the Intune policy and saying that they can enroll their personal devices, may want to just include the BYOD group here. So regardless, probably likely like everything else that you do, to go ahead and put these into report only mode, test them out, and then roll them out further. But I'm going to go ahead and create this guy. The next policy we're going to create here is the app enforced restrictions. This is again where we're preventing the user, if they're opening up a document either from their OneDrive or from SharePoint, we're preventing them from downloading that locally to their machine. So within Entra here, we're going to go to new policy, and we're going to go ahead and call this 100 BYOD app enforced restrictions. And then for the users and groups, again, you could say all users here. And then under target resources, this is where we're going to actually say select apps. And with this one, we're just specifically targeting SharePoint, which would encompass OneDrive as part of that, if you understand the hierarchy there that's going on. And then again, under the conditions here, we would filter out our devices that are corporate owned. So I'm going to go trust type equals Entra joined. Again, you could do device ownership equals company as well. So there's a couple different ways that you could modify that. I typically like to do joined just because it's a better source of truth for me. And then under the grant controls, you got to go ahead and grant access. We're not going to select any of these other factors because we should be enforcing MFA with their own unique policy with that. And then under the session, this is usually grayed out if you have anything like all apps selected, but because we have the approved app within here, we're able to go ahead and select use app enforced restrictions as part of this. And then we're going to go ahead and leave this also in a report only state. Next policy here is for the session controls. And this is basically limiting the time of the session. So you could set this to 1 hour, 4 hours, something like that, where they have to more periodically sign in. So within the Entra portal, we'll add a new policy. Say this is BYOD limit session. And again, here we could select all users. For the target resources, we could select all cloud apps. For the conditions on this one, you could also filter out our devices here. And we could say that the trust type again is equal to Entra joined. You can add another expression here where you say or is compliant equals true. And this is basically, we have this designation that says, like, if you're enrolled in Intune and your device is compliant, we can exclude you from the actual session length. So this is going back to the point of if they enrolled the personal device in Intune, it meets our base level compliance policy, then we're going to go ahead and allow this to not have this shorter session. So under the grant controls, you're going to grant access, nothing additional we need to do there. But then underneath the session controls, we're going to say that the sign-in frequency, periodic authentication, this is where, you could set this to 4. I think that's, a little bit warranted. They could even do it down to 3. If you do 1, that's pretty aggressive. That's going to kick the user out every hour and make them sign back in again. But it does kind of ensure that they're moving towards an area of compliance by using a managed device, right? So I kind of like it in that way because it's kind of driving people towards the compliant behavior, given their experience with this on their personal device isn't going to be as great or not so great. And then for the persistent browser session, you'll say never persistent. And we'll go ahead and we have all this configured now. Again, another policy, anytime you're excluding or including all users, you always want to ask yourself, should I be excluding a Bright Glass account? Just in case, especially if we're doing a combination of all users and all apps. So just a best practice there, for these policies. Require tap for Intune enrollments next. The tap is a temporary access pass. This is going to require that you have an SOP kind of developed for your help desk to be able to go in, and when a user wants to enroll into Intune or enroll their device for personal access, that's communicated to them. They'll have a better experience because maybe we can do that with the session controls like you just saw, where they have longer session times, can add some flexibility. And we also get a little bit more purview into the device not just being a complete train wreck from a security protection standpoint. It also allows us to basically approve devices that are joining our quote unquote network, right? And I think that's really the big piece to this. So this one's a little bit different because within Entra, we want to go into authentication strengths first. And we want to go ahead and add a new authentication strength. We're just going to call this tap. And within here, I'm going to go ahead and say that this is a one-time use temporary access pass. And we're going to go next and we're going to create. Take note that after you do create this for the first time, it does take a couple minutes to propagate where you'll be able to see it in the next steps that we're going to do, which is the conditional access policy. So if you go under new policy here for this one, we're going to go 100 tab for Intune enrollment. If you're wondering why I'm using this 100 designation, it's typically a designation I'm leveraging as a naming convention for policies that I institute in every client environment, no matter what. So this is kind of our baseline for BYOD, if you will. And then you go up to 200 to 300, where it might require some more end user notification templates, things like that as well, versus what we do out of the box. So for this one, you want to say all users. For the targeted resources, we're going to select an app here. You need to specifically type in Microsoft Intune, not just Intune. Just a helpful fact there that you run into, because it won't surface if you actually just type in Intune. So we want Microsoft Intune enrollment as our application. And then under the condition section, you don't necessarily have to configure anything for this one. We don't really aren't filtering out for any devices. We're basically just saying like anything that goes through and tries to enroll into Intune requires a tap. So under the require authentication strength, we're going to scroll down, we're going to see tap, which is what we just configured there. And then nothing for the session control. So this is 100 tap for enrollment. This gives us the ability here to go ahead and set that so that when a user is enrolling, they're requiring a temporary access password, which is for one-time use. As a technician, you can go ahead and generate a tap. If you go under the user section here and you go to a user and you go under authentication methods, and then from here you would click on add authentication method. And then you would choose the temporary access pass. You could delay the start time here if you wanted to. You can set the activation duration and say that it's one-time use, and then you'll be able to get that in order to go ahead and pass that along to the user so that they can generate and go ahead and enroll their device into Intune. Last policy here that we're taking a look at is requiring a MAM policy for mobile. This is mobile application management. Again, it's a lightweight method of protecting application data on personal devices without needing to enroll the entire device. So for this one, we're actually going to step into the Intune Admin Center and go under apps, and under app protection policies is where you'll be able to create this. You can create one for iOS and Android as well. This is beyond the scope of this video. I have done other videos and there's plenty online out there for going ahead and setting up these policies. But what I wanted to show you is you can target the Microsoft applications as what to protect. And then you have all of these various settings here, which give you capabilities to prevent save as into stuff like iCloud. It prevents cut, copy, paste capabilities into unmanaged apps, like copying a file from OneDrive into Google Drive as an example. You can prevent org data being printed. You can require encryption, which is a great compliance check, for what we're doing. And under the access requirements, can also additionally require further authentication like a PIN, or you could allow them to use Face ID or even sign in with their credentials, which I don't advise because that's more disruptive to the user. But then effectively here, we also have some basic policy management where blocking access on jailbroken rooted devices, and then we can wipe the data of 90 days of inactivity. And that's just on the device layer, and it's not blowing away their data anywhere else. And they can get it right back if they were to sign back in again. It's just a matter of wiping that at that point in time. So all these policies you can do for Android as well. But if we pivot back into Entra now, we go under conditional access policies, we can go to new policy here. And we can say 100, we can say mobile app protection. This is not required to do the initial kind of configuration where basically if they go to Outlook, the Outlook app on iOS, for example, and sign in, they will actually have that application data managed by you with that policy. What this is additionally doing, if we pair it with a conditional access policy, is that we're basically saying that we need to require approved client applications, meaning the user will not be able to access their email in the native mail client. They will have and be forced to move into Outlook. They do get a friendlier flow with that, where it says, hey, your organization requires you to use the Outlook and approved application and redirect them to the iOS store. But it is something that you want to be cognizant of here for just their overall experience. Under the grant controls, you would select approve app protection policy. They're going to go ahead and say, like in this message here, right, you no longer should use this as it will be retiring soon. And they're just going to make you use this app protection policy, which is giving you a list here of the approved applications. You know, it's a bunch of Microsoft apps, which will exclude the native apps on iOS and Android. The problem that you'll run up into, if you've never done this before, is that we have some sensitive Snowflake users out there that get really angry if you get them off of their native mail app or the calendar app that they're using, and they have a mix of their work information in their Gmail account or something like that, and they start squawking pretty hard. So it's good to produce a lot of communications around the need for this before basically rolling it out. But this would allow you to lock down access and secure the data at the application layer, even on mobile devices. The other thing, this one I did forget to mention here, but I got corrected here when I tried to create it, is that under the device platforms, you do need to select this and configure the iOS and Android selection as far as the inclusion goes, and then we'll get that error message to go away because we can only apply these app protection policies in this particular case to iOS and Android. You just have things with Windows information protection beyond the scope here, but you do want to do that in order to be able to create the policy. Okay guys, that's all the policies there. And again, in the next video that I will be doing, we'll be going through kind of the base level policies that I would also institute just for your core managed devices, because we also want to basically funnel the traffic in there and have some restrictions, much like we did very previously here for the devices that are accessing corporate resources and not just open to the world as it is by default. Okay guys, that's everything I had for you today. If you enjoyed this video, definitely check out one I posted a few weeks ago around token theft and the best conditional access policies to apply there. Very similar to this video in the sense of the context. I'll see you guys next week.